Have you ever walked out onto your own land and realized someone had just taken it from you? That's exactly what happened to David when he stepped onto his sprawling rural property one crisp morning. The sun was barely rising, casting long shadows across the rolling hills he had inherited from his grandparents, when a sight stopped him cold. 35 brand-new homes, gleaming in the early light, had appeared where there had once only been open fields and the gentle murmur of his dam-fed creek. At first, David couldn't believe his eyes. He blinked, rubbed them, and walked closer, hoping the sight was some cruel trick of perspective. But no, there they were. Neatly lined houses with freshly painted walls, manicured lawns, and construction signs still planted in the dirt. The HOA logo glared back at him like a mocking stamp, a symbol of the authority that had just trampled over decades of family legacy. A mix of disbelief, anger, and betrayal surged through him. How could they build on his property without permission? Without even a notice? Every corner of that land held memories. Picnics as a child, summer evenings with his parents watching the dam glisten in the sunset, the very earth beneath his feet that had nourished his family for generations. And now, in the span of a few weeks, or maybe even days, it was overtaken by strangers, their laughter and footsteps a violation of everything he held dear. He stormed toward the first construction site, waving his arms, shouting at the workers to stop. But they ignored him, headphones on, machines roaring, busy finishing what the HOA had authorized. It felt like the world had turned upside down. Even the neighbors, some of whom had once been friendly, kept their distance, their eyes avoiding his, as if acknowledging his outrage was itself dangerous. David's gaze drifted toward the dam at the far edge of his property, the small structure he had always maintained himself. It had never been more than a tranquil water source, a backdrop for his life here. But suddenly, it seemed like the only piece of power left in his hands. He knew the water behind it could do more than just reflect the sky. It could be a tool, a message, a statement. But was he ready to cross that line? As he turned back toward the rows of homes, he realized something chilling. The HOA wasn't just careless. They were deliberate. Every house had been built quickly, precisely, and with the kind of authority that said, "You can't stop us." That thought sparked a fire inside him. This was no longer about ownership. It was about respect, justice, and the fight to reclaim what was rightfully his. And in that moment, standing on the edge of his flooded fields and unwelcoming homes, David made a silent vow. He would not let this go. The question wasn't if he would act. It was how. David knew he couldn't handle this alone. But the first step was confronting the HOA directly. He stormed into their office, papers in hand, his heart pounding from the mix of anger and anxiety. The receptionist glanced up, feigning surprise, and pointed him toward the manager's office. Within minutes, David was face-to-face with the HOA president, a sharply dressed woman named Karen, whose smile was as cold as the polished floor beneath their feet. "I'm here about my property," David began, trying to keep his voice steady. "You've built 35 homes on land that belongs to me. I demand answers." Karen's smile didn't waver. "Your property?" "Mr. Lewis, all permits were approved. The homes are fully authorized. There's nothing illegal here." David's stomach dropped. "Fully authorized? You mean someone signed papers without my knowledge? Without my consent? That's theft." "Not theft," Karen replied smoothly, leaning back in her chair. "Development requires oversight. We're ensuring the community grows in an organized way. If you have an issue, there's a legal process." The words hit David like a punch. A legal process? By the time the courts responded, his land, his family's land, would be irrevocably changed. He realized quickly that bureaucracy favored them, not him. And as Karen handed him a stack of papers, each filled with legal jargon and clauses designed to confuse and intimidate, David felt the crushing weight of helplessness. Returning home, he noticed the neighbors watching from across the road. Some shook their heads in sympathy, while others whispered and quickly looked away. A few were clearly afraid to speak out. The HOA had a reputation for being relentless, and David sensed the fear in their eyes. He wasn't alone in this fight, but he might be the only one willing to step up. Back on his property, David walked along the edge of his dam, staring at the water that had always brought peace. The gentle murmur of the stream seemed almost mocking now, a reminder of what was at stake. He ran his hands through his hair, frustration boiling over. "They think they can bulldoze through my life," he muttered. "They think I'll just accept it." That night, he sat at the kitchen table, poring over maps, property deeds, and HOA regulations. Each page made him more determined and angrier. The HOA had overstepped every boundary, both legally and morally. But as he traced the lines of his land, one thought kept returning: the dam. It was small, but powerful. It was entirely under his control. A plan began to form in his mind, cautious at first, like a whisper. Could he really use it to regain what was stolen? As he drifted off to sleep, the tension inside him didn't abate. He knew the next days would be critical. Every decision mattered. Every action could tip the scales. The HOA believed they held all the power, but David understood that desperation and determination were forces the bureaucracy could never predict. By sunrise, he had made a silent vow to himself. He would fight, but he would also be smart. Every move would count, and deep down he felt a thrill, the first spark of hope that justice might still be within his grasp. The morning sun poured through the windows of David's home, but it brought little warmth to his thoughts. The previous day's confrontation with the HOA had left him mentally exhausted. He had wrestled with anger, disbelief, and a growing sense of urgency, and now the reality settled in. The law might not protect him quickly enough. 35 homes on his land were not going to disappear with a court order tomorrow. Time was slipping away, and with it, his chance to reclaim what was his. David sat at the old wooden table in his study, surrounded by papers, maps, and his laptop. Every legal avenue he explored seemed like a slow-moving trap, full of loopholes favoring the HOA. Attorneys warned of drawn-out battles, fines, and uncertain outcomes. Friends urged patience, insisting that the system would eventually deliver justice. But David's gut told him otherwise. Justice delayed was justice denied. As he considered his options, a shadow of doubt crept in. Could he really take matters into his own hands? The dam at the edge of his property had always been a serene presence, a source of life and sustenance. Now it represented something far more dangerous, a potential lever against the intrusion that threatened everything he held dear. Could he wield that power responsibly? Or would crossing that line destroy him morally as well as legally? His inner conflict grew as he weighed the risks. On one hand, patience might preserve his conscience but leave him powerless. On the other, decisive action could reclaim his land but carry consequences he couldn't predict. He imagined the floodwaters sweeping across the new homes, envisioning the shock and awe it would provoke in the HOA. And yet, he also pictured collateral damage, innocent neighbors caught in the aftermath, and the legal storm that would follow. The thought made him shiver. David's nights became restless. He walked the perimeter of his property, staring at the dam and the homes in the distance. Each time he looked at the smooth facades of the houses, he felt a mixture of rage and sorrow. This land had been in his family for generations. Every tree, creek, and stone held memories. The HOA's intrusion wasn't just a legal violation. It was an emotional assault, and the longer he waited, the more it wounded him. To gain clarity, David sought counsel from a few trusted friends. Some warned him sternly, "Don't do anything reckless. You could go to jail." Others, however, recognized the injustice and quietly encouraged him to consider alternatives. They didn't speak of violence or destruction, but of creative, strategic ways to reclaim control. Their voices nudged him toward a path that required both cunning and courage. By the end of the week, David had made a decision. He would act, but cautiously. He would plan every step, ensuring that he could strike with precision, leveraging the dam and his intimate knowledge of the land. This wasn't about revenge. It was about protecting what was rightfully his. Every sleepless night, every moment of doubt, strengthened his resolve. He knew the coming days would test his limits, but deep down, he realized something vital. Desperation had given birth to determination, and determination was a force the HOA could never anticipate. David didn't rush into action immediately. Instead, he began testing the boundaries, probing for weaknesses in the HOA's seemingly impenetrable authority. Early attempts were small but deliberate. He posted notices along the edge of the property, warning construction crews that they were trespassing. He called city officials to question the permits and double-checked every clause in the legal documents the HOA had handed him. Each step was measured, cautious, but necessary. At first, these efforts brought minor victories. A construction crew paused briefly when confronted, glancing nervously at David's papers before returning to work. One neighbor even approached him quietly, offering information about irregularities in the permits he had discovered. It felt like a spark of hope, the first signs that the HOA was not untouchable. For a moment, David believed that persistence and pressure might be enough to reclaim his land without escalation. But with every small win came setbacks. The HOA responded with bureaucracy, lawyers, and intimidation. Notices were ignored or dismissed, emails went unanswered, and official letters threatened fines for what they framed as harassment. David felt a creeping frustration. Every time he gained a foothold, the HOA built 2 more layers of defense around the homes. He began to understand just how organized and ruthless they could be, and that made each decision heavier with consequence. One afternoon, David tried to physically block access to a small portion of the property, where construction was still ongoing. He placed barriers and posted warning signs, hoping to slow them down even temporarily. But within hours, machinery arrived, and the workers bypassed the obstacles with efficiency, almost as if daring him to escalate further. Watching the bulldozers crush his warnings under steel treads, David felt a wave of helplessness wash over him. Yet, even in that frustration, a spark ignited, a realization that half measures would never be enough. Neighbors continued to watch silently. Some sympathized but refused involvement. Others whispered rumors, and rumors fueled the HOA's perception of control. David felt both isolated and pressured. The land that had once been a sanctuary now felt like a battlefield, each tree, hill, and creek strategically observed by unseen eyes. Every minor victory came with a cost: exhaustion, doubt, and the gnawing sense that he might soon face a point of no return. Despite the setbacks, David's determination only grew. The dam remained untouched, a silent reminder of the leverage he still controlled. Each frustration, every narrow escape of property damage, sharpened his resolve. He began drafting a plan that required precision, timing, and understanding of the land's natural power. The minor victories had shown him the HOA's arrogance, and the setbacks had shown him their persistence. But David now knew that he had the patience, knowledge, and determination to confront them on his terms. By nightfall, as the orange glow of the sunset reflected on the water of the dam, David made a quiet vow. Small victories were lessons. Setbacks were warnings. Every move now would count, and the stage was being set for something that would finally tip the scales in his favor. David spent days preparing, moving carefully through the shadows of the property he knew like the back of his hand. Every inch of the land had been memorized over decades. The twists of the creek, the height of the dam, the weak points in the perimeter around the new homes. What had once been a peaceful sanctuary was now a tactical map in his mind, each detail critical for the plan he was about to execute. He knew this wasn't a decision to be made lightly. There was no turning back once he acted. Yet, a strange clarity settled over him as he considered the risks. The dam, long overlooked by the HOA, was under his control entirely. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about asserting ownership, protecting the land that had been wrongfully invaded. Every calculation, every precaution, was designed to minimize collateral damage while sending a clear message: trespassers were not welcome. To ensure success, David took stealthy measures over the next few nights. He inspected the dam's gates, checked the flow of water, and made adjustments that would allow him to release it on his terms. Timing was everything. The HOA had no idea how much power the water behind the dam could wield. One wrong move could backfire catastrophically, but every precise step increased his confidence. He also monitored the homes, noting the patterns of the workers and HOA representatives. Some were careless, leaving gates unlocked or vehicles unattended. Others were cautious, patrolling in shifts, unaware of the plan unfolding right beneath their noses. David jotted notes, adjusted his timing, and rehearsed each step mentally, treating it like a carefully choreographed operation. Throughout this process, his emotions were a mix of tension, fear, and anticipation. The moral weight of what he was about to do pressed heavily on his mind. But he reminded himself that the HOA had ignored all other attempts at justice. Theirs had been a relentless march over his property, leaving him with no other options. Now, the initiative was in his hands. As night fell before the decisive day, David stood by the dam under a pale moonlight. The water behind him glistened quietly, almost tauntingly, as if aware of the storm it was about to unleash. He double-checked every valve, every safety measure, and took a deep breath, feeling a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. This was the moment where planning met action. The stage was set. The HOA had built their empire of 35 homes on his land, confident in their authority and oblivious to the consequences. David, however, had a weapon they hadn't accounted for, a combination of knowledge, strategy, and controlled power. All that remained was the final move, the execution of a plan that would change everything. By the early hours of the morning, the first signs of movement began. Every calculation, every sleepless night had led to this point. David knew that once the water was released, there would be no going back. The turning point had arrived, not just for him, but for the HOA that had underestimated the determination of a landowner who refused to be ignored. The early morning air was crisp and still, holding a tension that seemed almost tangible. David stood by the dam, eyes fixed on the calm water behind him. To anyone else, it appeared peaceful, serene, even harmless. But David knew the force it contained. Every valve, every gate had been tested, and now it was time. He took a deep breath, feeling a surge of adrenaline as he reached for the lever that would change everything. In the distance, the first lights of the HOA workers flickered on in the newly built homes. They were oblivious, unaware that their carefully constructed world was about to face the consequences of their audacity. David hesitated for only a heartbeat, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down. But then he reminded himself, this was justice, reclaiming what was rightfully his. With a firm pull, the gates of the dam began to open. The water surged forward, a controlled but powerful torrent rushing down the channels David had carefully mapped. The sound was deafening, a roaring, unstoppable force that carried the promise of retribution. Dirt, grass, and debris tumbled in its wake, and the landscape shifted violently as the water spread toward the homes that should never have been built. David watched, heart pounding, as the first signs of chaos appeared. The neatly arranged lawns were swept away, fences collapsed, and construction materials tumbled into the rising current. The HOA workers ran frantically, shouting to each other, scrambling to salvage anything they could. But the power of the water was overwhelming. 35 homes, the symbol of their arrogance, were no match for the force David had unleashed with precision. Even as the destruction unfolded, David's emotions were conflicted. There was satisfaction, undeniable and intense, at seeing the symbols of trespassers humbled. But there was also a sobering awareness of the sheer force of nature he had controlled. He had acted decisively, but he had also witnessed the fragility of human constructs in the face of something greater. Neighbors began to emerge cautiously, drawn by the roar of the flood. Some stared in disbelief, others whispered, realizing that David had done what few could have imagined. The HOA, once smug and untouchable, now faced the consequences of underestimating the determination of a property owner who refused to back down. By mid-morning, the water had receded, leaving behind a transformed landscape. Homes were damaged or destroyed, lawns flattened, and the once pristine neighborhood disrupted. David walked the perimeter of his land, heart still racing, surveying the results. Justice had been served, but at a cost. The floodwaters had left scars, not only on the land, but on the memory of everyone involved. As he stood by the dam, watching the last ripples settle, David felt a mixture of relief, vindication, and contemplation. He had reclaimed control of his property, sent a powerful message, and demonstrated that determination could overcome even the most entrenched authority. Yet deep down, he knew this moment would leave questions lingering about the line between justice and action, and the power one person could wield when pushed too far. The sun hung low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the transformed landscape. David stood on the edge of his property, surveying the aftermath of the dam release. The 35 homes that had so arrogantly risen on his land were now reduced to twisted wood, flattened fences, and mud-streaked remnants of what the HOA had thought was permanent. The water had receded, leaving behind scars that spoke louder than any argument or legal notice ever could. David felt a surge of relief and vindication, but it was tempered by reflection. The act had been drastic, and the consequences had been severe. The HOA would face investigations, lawsuits, and public scrutiny. Neighbors would talk for months, some with admiration, some with fear. And David himself would carry the memory of the flood for years to come, a reminder that power and determination come with weighty responsibilities. He walked along the creek, watching the calm return to the water he had so carefully controlled. It felt strange to see peace after such chaos, yet there was also a sense of balance restored. The land was his again, not because the flood had erased the HOA's presence completely, but because he had shown that he would protect it, no matter the odds. As neighbors began to cautiously approach, David realized that respect was quietly shifting in the community. Some admired his courage and cleverness, while others felt a cautious distance, understanding that underestimating someone's resolve could have consequences far beyond expectations. It was a lesson that would linger, a subtle but powerful warning etched into memory. Sitting by the edge of the dam, David reflected on everything that had led to this moment. The anger, frustration, sleepless nights, and moral dilemmas had all culminated in a decisive action that restored control over his property. But more than that, it had revealed something essential about human nature. The lengths one will go to protect what is theirs, and the quiet strength that grows when pushed to the edge. He thought about the HOA, about the arrogance that had led them to believe they could take what wasn't theirs without consequence. And he thought about himself, about the careful planning, the courage, and even the restraint that had prevented unnecessary harm. There was a clarity in that reflection, a lesson he knew he would carry forever. David looked up at the sky, letting the cool breeze wash over him. "What would you do if someone took what was yours?" he whispered, a rhetorical question lingering in the air. It wasn't meant to challenge the HOA. It was meant to challenge every viewer, every neighbor, and every person who had ever faced injustice. At some point, everyone must decide how far they are willing to go to protect what matters most. And in that quiet moment, the land settled back into its rightful rhythm, the dam murmuring softly, and David understood that justice isn't always neat or simple, but it is undeniable when courage meets action.